infectious diseases, research, medicine, health. Welcome to Outbreak News Interviews. And now, broadcasting from the Outbreak News Skylar Studios in beautiful West Central Florida, here is your host, microbiologist and editor of OutbreakNewsToday.com, Robert Harriman.
Well, hey everybody, this is Robert, and welcome to Outbreak News Interviews. Now, researchers from the University of Oklahoma and Denmark published recently the first known study to prove the transmission of the bacterial pathogen Campylobacter through sexual contact, and this was published in the journal Emerging Infectious Diseases. Well, joining me today to discuss the study is assistant professor in the Department of Biostatistics and Epidemiology in the OU Hudson College of Public Health, infectious disease epidemiologist Katrin Kuhn, PhD. Dr. Kuhn, welcome to the show, ma'am.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me.
Well, Dr. Kuhn, let's start out with just a little primer on the organism itself. What is Campylobacter, and how does someone typically contract it?
So Campylobacter is one of those bacteria that's kind of hovering in the background all the time. It's taken a backseat in comparison to Salmonella, which we all know as one of the most famous foodborne bacteria. But Campylobacter is actually much more common than Salmonella, especially in the Western world and even here in the U.S. Campylobacter, as I said, is a bacterium. It is living in wild birds and in domesticated birds such as chickens and turkeys. You'll also find it in cattle, and something that we've discovered recently is that it's prevalent in many environmental reservoirs. So you can find it in water and in sand and in mud, basically everywhere where these animals, so particularly the birds, have a chance to poop. Traditionally, Campylobacter has been considered as a foodborne disease. That means you get infected with it when you eat food that's infected with the bacteria, so that's particularly poultry. Here in the West, it's primarily chicken, turkey, and there's also a chance to become infected if you drink milk that hasn't been pasteurized. Lately, we've done some studies to show that there is also some cases that we can't really explain where they got their infection from because it doesn't seem to be related to food, so we have started investigating the role of other reservoirs, and in particular those in the environment. And we found some evidence that you can also become infected if you have contact to these places where the birds and the cattle poop. So that could be the sand and the water and, you know, little puddles of water maybe in your garden, or if you have a paddling pool for children. And as I said, Campylobacter is a very important disease. It's the most common foodborne disease throughout the Western world. We don't have so much evidence from the developing world yet, because, frankly, they have many other diseases to worry about at the moment. But it is, it's kind of, it's very common, it's very frequent, and it's the most commonly reported foodborne bacterium in this part of the world.
All right. And you mentioned it's common a couple times there. Do we have any numbers? How common is it globally and here in the U.S.?
So I don't really have any good numbers for it, but and as for those foodborne diseases, the numbers that we do have tend to underestimate the real problem. I can say that it's about twice as common as Salmonella, reportedly, but actually what we see of the reported cases, we think represent only about maybe 1/10 or even 1/20 of what is actually happening in the society. So we reckon that for each person who is reported with a Campylobacter infection, 10 to 20 people out there are also infected at the same time. Mm-hmm. So you might be looking at millions of cases in the U.S. every year.
Okay. And the pathology, obviously Campylobacter is a gastrointestinal pathogen. What kind of disease do we see outside of the gastrointestinal area?
So you get a pretty hefty diarrhea. The most common manifestation with the diarrhea is that it's bloody, and that's actually often what makes people go to the doctor and get tested. Mm-hmm. Apart from the stomach upsets, Campylobacter is known to cause some long-term side effects, and that's particularly with arthritis, something called reactive arthritis that can persist for months. and more seriously, a syndrome called Guillain-Barré syndrome. It's kind of a paralysis. It's a neurological disorder that affects your nervous system, and you can end up becoming paralyzed or even dying from this. Thankfully, it's very rare.
That's good. Now, you and your colleagues say the results of your study confirm that sexual contact is a risk factor for Campylobacteria. Before I ask you about the research, I do have two quick questions. Dr. Kuhn, why is this research important? And the other question I'm asking as a microbiologist, didn't we already know that this was a risk through sexual contact, or is that just anecdotal?
Well, I'll start with the second part of your question. So we had a suspicion, and with all gastrointestinal bacteria, we always assumed there was a risk that you can become infected through certain sexual contact types, but we didn't actually know for Campylobacter. There is really only one so-called foodborne organism that's called Shigella, where we know for sure that it's a risk to be transmitted during sexual contact. So for us, it was really important to discover this with Campylobacter also. And what made us think about it was actually an outbreak happening in Norway. One of my colleagues reported it to me, and I started thinking about, well, if we can see a disease like this causing an outbreak, then it's probably also likely transmitted sporadically. So if people take these kind of sexual contacts, then you are at risk of increased transmission.
Okay. So let's go ahead and take a look at the research. It was quite a lengthy study using data from Denmark. I don't know, it was 9 years long, I believe, the data. And if you can go ahead and take it from here, can you discuss the method and the study design of your research?
So we started off with what I would say is an inverted case control study. So in Denmark, it's a very good system for reporting infectious diseases and diseases in general, and we have a really good population register that actually allowed us to define a population that was at risk. So our at-risk population, or the cases, were defined as men who have sex with men, who we know when they have sex, they have this contact that we think is a risk factor for Campylobacter infection. So those were our cases. And then we went through our registers and we defined any infection among these men with either Campylobacter, Salmonella, or Shigella as an exposure. So we linked up our registers to find a group of men who have sex with men, and then looked to see how many of them were infected with Campylobacter, Salmonella, or Shigella over the 9-year period. And we found by doing this classical inverted case control study that there was a 14 times higher risk of developing a Campylobacter infection among our men who have sex with men group, which was kind of similar to what we saw for Shigella that we mentioned before is known to be transmitted through sexual contact, but there was no evidence for Salmonella being reported more frequently among our group of men who have sex with men.
And why is that, Dr. Kuhn? I'm sorry. Why is that, the Salmonella?
Well, it's obviously it's hard to say. There could be many reasons for that, but one of the reasons that we were discussing in our study is because Salmonella has a relatively it has a high infectious dose. That means you need to ingest or you need to be in contact with a lot of the bacteria before you actually become infected with it. On the opposite end, you have Campylobacter and Shigella. They have a low infectious dose, which means you don't need to ingest so many bacteria before you become infected and have symptoms. Okay,
very good. I'm sorry, you can continue, please.
So I think that's what I wanted to say, actually. So,
okay.
By looking at these results, it led us to conclude that there is really now good evidence by doing a solid case control study with a population that was well defined and with high quality data that we could see that Campylobacter has also a higher risk of being transmitted during sexual contact, like Shigella, that we knew already.
All right, very good. Was there anything else in your findings?
Not that I can think of at the moment.
Okay.
I think our main conclusion about this, you asked also before, why is this important? Well, it's important because, as I mentioned before, Campylobacter is very prevalent It's prevalent in food. It's a common infection among people, and by actually having another transmission route that we know is risky, then it will enable us to identify the people who are more at risk of getting it this way, and also making guidelines for them and say, when you have this sexual contact, you have to be aware that there are other infections that you can also get apart from obviously the standard sexually transmitted diseases. You also have to think about some of the foodborne pathogens.
Yeah, good point. Dr. Kuhn, will you be doing any further research on this topic?
Well, I certainly hope so. As I mentioned before, that Campylobacter is just as common in the U.S. as it is in Denmark. And if I'm able to collect the right data here, if I can have access to the right data, I would love to be able to do a similar study to see if the same is applicable to the data that I can get for the U.S. to show that what we found for the Danish patient, what we found for the Danish study group is actually the same in the U.S. I'm pretty sure that it is. I've seen reports of outbreaks with Campylobacter among men who have sex with men reported from some parts of the U.S. as well as Canada. So I think if we can find some really strong data to link up, we can do a similar study here.
Good. Now, the study, which was published in the CDC journal Emerging Infectious Diseases, is titled Sexual Contact as Risk Factor for Campylobacter Infection, Denmark. Now, I'll go ahead and link to that in the show notes when I publish the podcast. And I want to thank you, Dr. Katrine Kuhn, for sharing your research with us today. I appreciate it, ma'am.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Robert. It was a pleasure.
All right. Have a great day.